mind games, paranoia, and twisted realities. These psychological thrillers from cinema's golden age didn't just scare audiences, they broke their brains. Hollywood executives today wouldn't even read scripts this disturbing. One film caused actual panic attacks in theaters. Another was locked in a vault for decades. Let's unravel the 23rd most brilliant psychological mindbenders ever committed to celluloid. Gaslight, 1944. Paula's slowly losing her mind. Or is someone deliberately driving her insane? Ingrid Bergman won her first Oscar playing a woman whose husband manipulates her reality so thoroughly that gaslighting became our term for psychological abuse. The film takes psychological warfare to terrifying heights, with Charles Boyer's villain using dimming gaslights and footsteps in empty rooms to make his wife question her sanity. MGM bought the rights to the 1940 British version and tried destroying every print just to prevent comparisons. Director George Cukor insisted on shooting with authentic Victorian gaslights, creating those iconic flickering shadows that symbolize the film's psychological manipulation. Critics initially dismissed it as women's melodrama until Bergman's performance silenced them. The American Film Institute later ranked it among the greatest thrillers ever made. This film literally gave us the vocabulary to describe toxic relationships, proving cinema can change how we understand psychological abuse. Spellbound, 1945. A psychiatrist falls for an amnesiac who might be a murderer. Hitchcock didn't just make a thriller about psychoanalysis. He got Salvador Dali to design the dream sequences. Gregory Peck plays a man who can't remember who he is, while Ingrid Bergman's psychiatrist must unravel his fractured mind before the police catch up. The famous 20-minute Dali sequence got butchered to just 2 minutes by producer David O. Selznick, who thought audiences wouldn't tolerate surrealism. The original footage mysteriously vanished. Hitchcock used innovative point-of-view shots where spinning wheels and giant eyeballs create genuine psychological disorientation. The film's portrayal of psychoanalysis was so influential that enrollment in psychology programs jumped 40% the following year. Made for $1.7 million, it pulled in over $7 million and scored 6 Oscar nominations. Critics initially called it pretentious nonsense, but its reputation grew as audiences recognized how accurately it portrayed the fragility of memory and identity. The Spiral Staircase, 1946. A mute woman realizes she's the next target of a killer who murders imperfect women. Dorothy McGuire gives a masterclass in silent acting as Helen, who lost her voice from childhood trauma. Now she's trapped in a Victorian mansion during a thunderstorm with a killer who's methodically eliminating women with disabilities. Director Robert Siodmak creates unbearable tension with extreme close-ups of the killer's eye, watching Helen through holes in paintings. The film pioneered psychological profiling in cinema, showing a killer motivated by twisted psychological compulsions rather than money or revenge. RKO Pictures nearly shelved it, fearing audiences wouldn't accept a protagonist who never speaks. Instead, it made $3.5 million on a modest budget and became a template for the psychological woman in peril thriller. Siodmak used innovative camera techniques where shadows on the spiral staircase represent the twisted pathways of the killer's mind. Martin Scorsese later called it the most psychologically accurate thriller of the 1940s. Is herself. Barbara Stanwyck delivers a tour-de-force performance as Leona, an invalid whose only connection to the outside world is her telephone. Director Anatole Litvak stages the entire film in real time. Made it. The Third Man, 1949. A pulp novelist arrives in post-war Vienna to find his friend Harry Lime is dead. Or is he? Joseph Cotton plays Holly Martins, who discovers his childhood friend might be alive and running a deadly racket. Carol Reed's masterpiece uses tilted Dutch angles to create a disorienting psychological landscape where nothing is what it seems. The famous Ferris wheel scene, where Orson Welles delivers his cuckoo clock monologue about the moral bankruptcy of civilization, became an instant classic. Vienna itself becomes a psychological character, its bombed-out buildings and shadowy sewers reflecting the moral wreckage of post-war Europe. Reed insisted on shooting on location despite studio pressure, capturing the city's damaged psyche. Critics initially called it unnecessarily bizarre, but it went on to win the Grand Prix at Cannes. The film's zither score by Anton Karas became a worldwide hit, selling over 500,000 copies. Graham Greene's original ending was changed after arguments with producer David O. Selznick, who wanted something more conventionally satisfying. Greene never forgave him. Sunset Boulevard, 1950. A struggling screenwriter becomes psychologically trapped by a faded silent film star living in fantasy. Billy Wilder's noir masterpiece opens with the protagonist already dead, narrating from beyond the grave. William Holden plays Joe Gillis, who becomes the kept man of Gloria Swanson's delusional Norma Desmond, who believes she's still a beloved star. The film provides a devastating look at Hollywood's psychological cruelty, discarding people when their usefulness ends. Swanson, herself a former silent star, drew on personal experience for the role. Paramount executives reportedly walked out of the first screening, horrified by how it portrayed the industry. Louis B. Mayer screamed at Wilder, "You have disgraced the industry that made you." The film's famous last line, "All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up," has become the definitive portrayal of psychological delusion. Despite the controversy, it earned $2.6 million and 11 Oscar nominations. Wilder shot Norma's mansion on an actual decaying Hollywood estate, using the real home of a forgotten silent star to create the film's atmosphere of psychological decay. Strangers on a Train, 1951. Two strangers meet on a train. One proposes they swap murders, so neither can be caught. Hitchcock turns a chance encounter into a psychological nightmare. As Robert Walker's psychopathic, Bruno Anthony proposes the perfect crime to Farley Granger's tennis player, Guy Haynes. The famous carousel sequence, where horses gallop out of control during the climactic confrontation, required an elderly carousel operator to risk his life crawling under the spinning platform. Hitchcock used the two men's contrasting personalities to explore the duality of human nature, suggesting we all harbor dark impulses. Warner Brothers executives worried the film was too disturbing, particularly Bruno's thinly veiled attraction to Guy. Critics praised Walker's performance as Bruno, calling him the most charming psychopath in film history. The famous tennis match sequence intercuts the game with Bruno struggling to retrieve a lighter, creating unbearable psychological tension through parallel editing. Raymond Chandler initially wrote the screenplay, but clashed with Hitchcock so severely that his work was almost entirely discarded. The film grossed $3.8 million and cemented Hitchcock's reputation as master of psychological suspense. The Night of the Hunter, 1955. A murderous preacher hunts two children for hidden money. Charles Lawton's only directing effort was initially a commercial and critical failure. Today it's recognized as a psychological masterpiece. Robert Mitchum plays Reverend Harry Powell, a serial killer with love and hate tattooed on his knuckles, pursuing two children who know where their father hid $10,000. The film's expressionist style uses stark shadows and distorted perspectives to create a nightmarish fairy tale atmosphere. Lawton drew inspiration from German expressionist cinema and silent films, creating a unique psychological landscape that feels both timeless and deeply American. Mitchum's performance as Powell was so disturbing that parents of child actors refused to let him interact with their children off camera. The underwater shot of Shelley Winter's corpse sitting in a Model T, hair flowing with river weeds, became one of cinema's most haunting images. United Artists had no idea how to market such an unusual film. It flopped so badly that Lawton never directed again, calling the experience soul-crushing. Stanley Kubrick later cited it as a major influence on The Shining. Vertigo, 1958. A detective with fear of heights becomes obsessed with a woman he's hired to follow. Hitchcock's psychological masterpiece was a commercial disappointment that's now considered his greatest work. James Stewart plays Scotty Ferguson, whose acrophobia prevents him from saving a fellow officer's life. Later hired to follow Kim Novak's mysterious Madeline, he becomes entranced by her, setting up one of cinema's most disturbing psychological portraits of obsession. The famous Vertigo effect, combining a forward zoom with a backward track, visually represents Scotty's psychological disorientation. Hitchcock forced Novak to jump into the actual San Francisco Bay multiple times until she got the scene perfect. Paramount executives hated the film's bleak ending and demanded changes, which Hitchcock refused. Critics initially dismissed it as far-fetched nonsense, but in 2012, it displaced Citizen Kane as the greatest film ever made in Sight and Sound's influential critics poll. Bernard Herrmann's swirling score perfectly captures the psychological spiral of obsession. Hitchcock later said it was his most personal film. Psycho, 1960. A secretary steals money from her employer and checks into the wrong motel. Hitchcock's low-budget experiment changed cinema forever with its unprecedented psychological shock value. Janet Leigh stars as Marion Crane, whose fateful shower becomes cinema's most famous murder scene. Anthony Perkins creates one of film's greatest psychological villains as Norman Bates, the seemingly shy motel owner with mother issues. Paramount refused to finance the film, forcing Hitchcock to fund it himself and shoot with his television crew. The gamble paid $32 million on an $800,000 budget. The shower scene contains 78 camera setups and 52 cuts in just 45 seconds, but never actually shows the knife-touching flesh. Hitchcock purchased as many copies of Robert Bloch's novel as possible before release to preserve the twist ending. The film's psychological impact was so severe that many viewers reported being afraid to shower afterward. Censors initially objected to showing a flushing toilet, considering it indecent. The final reveal of Norman in a dress and wig, claiming to be his mother, delivered a psychological wallop that 1960 audiences weren't prepared for. Cape Fear, 1962. A lawyer's family is terrorized by a criminal he helped convict. Robert Mitchum creates one of cinema's most terrifying psychological villains as Max Cady, methodically stalking Gregory Peck's Sam Bowden and his family. Director J. Lee Thompson builds unbearable tension through psychological warfare, rather than physical violence. Cady's most unsettling quality is his patience, legally staying just within the law, while slowly destroying Bowden's sense of security. Bernard Herrmann's menacing score, which Martin Scorsese would later reuse in his remake, amplifies the psychological dread. The film's original script included explicit scenes that the studio refused to film, considering them too disturbing even for an adult thriller. Thompson used subjective camera angles to place viewers in both predator and prey positions, intensifying the psychological cat-and-mouse game. Gregory Peck, usually known for playing virtuous characters, pushed for moral ambiguity in his role, suggesting his character had deliberately withheld evidence that might have reduced Cady's sentence. The film grossed $5 million despite censorship battles and established a new standard for psychological menace in mainstream cinema. The Manchurian Candidate, 1962. A Korean war hero returns home, unaware he's been brainwashed to become an assassin. John Frankenheimer's Cold War thriller was so disturbing that it disappeared for nearly 25 years after Kennedy's assassination. Frank Sinatra plays a military intelligence officer plagued by nightmares, while Lawrence Harvey is the program killer whose trigger is a Queen of Diamonds playing card. Angela Lansbury delivers a chilling performance as Harvey's politically ambitious mother, whose psychological control over her son has incestuous overtones. The famous Garden Club sequence where brainwashed soldiers see a ladies' meeting when they're actually watching a communist demonstration brilliantly visualizes psychological manipulation. United Artists executives were so concerned about the film's controversial politics that they almost didn't release it. Sinatra later purchased the rights and kept it from circulation until 1988. Critics initially found it preposterous, but it's now recognized as prescient in its portrayal of political manipulation and psychological warfare. Frankenheimer used deep focus photography to keep both foreground and background in sharp focus, creating a sense of inescapable psychological surveillance. Repulsion, 1965. A woman left alone in an apartment descends into violent madness. Roman Polanski's psychological horror film follows Catherine Deneuve's Carol, whose fragile mental state collapses into full psychosis when her sister leaves for vacation. The apartment becomes a psychological landscape of her deteriorating mind, with walls that crack, hands that reach through, and hallucinated assaults. Polanski shot in black and white to heighten the clinical, documentary-like observation of mental collapse. The film's most disturbing aspect is how mundane Carol's environment is, suggesting psychological horror lurks just beneath ordinary reality. Critics were stunned by Deneuve's performance, transforming from vulnerable beauty to vacant-eyed killer. Produced for just $300,000, it became an art house hit and launched Polanski's international career. The British censors initially demanded extensive cuts, particularly of Carol's violent hallucinations. The film's unflinching portrayal of psychological disintegration influenced countless later films, from The Shining to Black Swan. Polanski later said he wanted viewers to experience a mental breakdown firsthand. Seconds, 1966. A middle-aged banker is offered a chance at a new life through a mysterious organization. John Frankenheimer's paranoid masterpiece stars Rock Hudson against type as a man who undergoes radical surgery to become someone new, only to discover his psychological problems follow him. The film's distorted wide-angle photography by James Wong Howe creates a perpetual sense of psychological unease. Paramount executives were so disturbed by early footage that they considered shutting down production. The wine-stomping orgy sequence required 260 extras, who actually got drunk during filming, creating genuine psychological frenzy. Audiences walked out of the Cannes premiere, and the film flopped so badly it nearly ended Frankenheimer's career. Its reputation grew through late-night television screenings, influencing filmmakers from David Fincher to Darren Aronofsky. The extreme close-ups during the surgery sequence were actual medical footage, adding to the psychological discomfort. The film's most haunting element is its suggestion that, even with a new face and identity, psychological dissatisfaction remains. Hudson later called it, "the only film I've made that I'm genuinely proud of." Wait Until Dark, 1967. A blind woman faces off against three criminals who believe a drug-filled doll is hidden in her apartment. Audrey Hepburn plays Susie Hendricks, recently blinded in an accident, who must use her other senses to survive when Alan Arkin's sadistic Harry Rote invades her home. Director Terrence Young builds psychological tension through Susie's vulnerability, creating what Roger Ebert called one of the most terrifying experiences in cinema. The famous climactic sequence, where Susie breaks all the lights to level the playing field against her sighted attacker, was enhanced in theaters by turning off all house lights. Audience screams were so loud during test screenings that some dialogue became inaudible. Hepburn prepared by spending weeks at a school for the blind, learning to move authentically without sight. Warner Brothers worried the film was too frightening for Hepburn's typical audience. Their concerns were justified when several viewers reportedly fainted during the film's jump scare climax. Made for $3 million, it grossed over $11 million and earned Hepburn an Oscar nomination. The film's psychological power comes from inverting typical thriller dynamics, making blindness ultimately an advantage rather than a weakness. Rosemary's Baby, 1968. A young woman becomes pregnant and suspects a satanic cult wants her baby. Roman Polanski's psychological horror masterpiece stars Mia Farrow as Rosemary Woodhouse, whose paranoia about her pregnancy grows increasingly justified. The film's genius lies in maintaining ambiguity about whether Rosemary's fears are legitimate or signs of mental illness, until the devastating final reveal. Paramount executives were reportedly horrified by the script, but allowed production after Polanski's Repulsion proved profitable. Farrow's frail appearance wasn't just acting, she was actually starving herself, eating only a single egg each day during filming. The film earned $33 million on a $3.2 million budget despite controversy from religious groups. Frank Sinatra served Farrow divorce papers on set when she refused to abandon the film for his movie. Polanski shot with an almost documentary-like naturalism, making the psychological horror more believable by grounding it in recognizable reality. The famous phone booth scene, where Rosemary desperately tries to reach her doctor while cult members watch, creates suffocating psychological isolation. Ruth Gordon won an Oscar for her performance as the seemingly sweet neighbor hiding sinister intentions. The Conversation, 1974. A surveillance expert becomes convinced he's recorded a murder plot. Francis Ford Coppola made this paranoid masterpiece between Godfather films, with Gene Hackman playing Harry Call, a wiretapping specialist whose latest assignment triggers a moral and psychological crisis. The film's opening sequence, a technical tour de force where Call attempts to record a couple's conversation in a crowded Union Square, establishes both his professional skill and the moral ambiguity of his work. Hackman created a character so psychologically isolated that he sleeps behind 3 locks and plays saxophone alone in his apartment. The famous line, "He'd kill us if he got the chance," becomes Harry's psychological obsession, as he repeatedly analyzes the recording, hearing different meanings each time. Coppola wrote the script before Watergate but released it during the scandal, making it seem eerily prescient. The film cost $1.6 million and made a modest profit, but critics recognized its brilliance immediately. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and earned 3 Oscar nominations. The final shot of Harry playing saxophone amid the wreckage of his apartment, having torn it apart looking for surveillance bugs, perfectly captures his complete psychological breakdown. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. A criminal fakes insanity to serve his sentence in a mental institution, then challenges the system. Milos Forman's adaptation of Ken Kesey's novel creates a devastating psychological battleground between Jack Nicholson's rebellious McMurphy and Louise Fletcher's coldly authoritarian Nurse Ratched. The film was shot in an actual Oregon mental hospital with real patients as extras, creating an authentic atmosphere of institutional control. To prepare, Nicholson lived in the psychiatric ward for weeks, while other actors stayed in character between takes. Producer Michael Douglas took the project to his father. Kirk had owned the rights for years, but became too old for the lead role. United Artists initially rejected the film as too depressing until Douglas secured independent financing. It became only the second film in history to win all 5 major Academy Awards. The devastating electroshock therapy scenes were filmed with technical accuracy, making them all the more psychologically disturbing. The film's psychological impact comes from its portrayal of how institutions crush individuality, with Ratched's passive-aggressive control more terrifying than outright brutality. Kesey himself refused to see the film, unhappy that it abandoned the novel's Native American narrator. Taxi Driver, 1976. An insomniac, Taxi Driver's psychological isolation drives him toward violence. Martin Scorsese's urban nightmare follows Robert De Niro's Travis Bickle, a Vietnam veteran whose disgust with New York's decay fuels his deteriorating mental state. The film creates a subjective psychological portrait, showing the city through Travis's increasingly disturbed perspective. Bernard Herrmann's final score, completed just hours before his death, perfectly captures Travis's psychological duality, alternating between lonely saxophone and threatening percussion. De Niro prepared by getting a taxi license and driving shifts in New York, while losing weight to achieve Travis's gaunt, sleepless appearance. Columbia Pictures nearly didn't release the film, concerned about its graphic violence and moral ambiguity. The MPAA initially gave it an X rating until Scorsese desaturated the color in the climactic shootout to make the blood less vivid. Despite controversies, it won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and earned 4 Oscar nominations. The film's psychological complexity is most evident in its ambiguous ending, where Travis's violence seemingly transforms him from potential assassin to media-celebrated hero. The famous "You Talkin' to Me" mirror scene was largely improvised by De Niro. The Tenant, 1976. A man moves into an apartment whose previous tenant attempted suicide and becomes convinced the building is driving him mad. Roman Polanski directed and starred in this psychological horror film, completing his apartment trilogy after Repulsion and Rosemary's Baby. Trelkowski, a quiet Polish immigrant in Paris, gradually adopts the identity of the previous tenant, even wearing her clothes and makeup. The building's other residents become increasingly hostile in his perception. forming a conspiracy to drive him to suicide. Polanski creates mounting psychological dread through subtle means. A tooth found in a wall, neighbors watching from across the courtyard, a mysterious bathroom toilet. The film's most disturbing sequence shows Trelkovsky looking across the courtyard to see himself in the opposite apartment, watching himself with binoculars. Paramount executives were baffled by the film's psychological ambiguity and barely promoted it. Critics were divided, with some calling it self-indulgent, while others recognized its brilliant portrayal of paranoia and alienation. The film flopped commercially, but developed a cult following. Its psychological power comes from never clarifying whether the conspiracy is real or imagined, maintaining the possibility that Trelkovsky's madness is actually a rational response to genuine persecution. Oscar nomination. The film's most disturbing psychological element is how ordinary location pointing and emitting an inhuman scream, and is now considered one of the greatest horror films ever made. These psychological thrillers didn't just entertain, they crawled inside your head and rearranged the furniture. Which one messed with your mind the most? Drop a comment below with your pick for the ultimate psychological mindbender. And here's a question worth debating. Could today's audiences, raised on jump scares and CGI monsters, even handle these slow-burning psychological masterpieces? Or have we lost our appetite for films that make us think while they terrify us?